Imagine an age without the internet, without the latest gadgets, without video games played long into the early hours, joined by other gamers from all over the world, all bent on fighting over some flipping chest in tilted towers.
Is he hunting? Hey!
Imagine a world where the loudest noises you can hear are the banging of hammers, or the din of battle, or the average football game. Okay, that's hard enough these days. And now imagine a world without even electricity. Okay, I hear you. Of course electricity existed, we just hadn't found a way to harness it yet. It still remained a mysterious and dangerous force of nature. Anyway, to end the suspense and get to the point, how did people in the medieval period entertain themselves? Well, trust me, it wasn't as boring as you think. Anyone who's taken a nice walk in the country, or gone camping, whether in the UK, United States, or Europe, anywhere, you'll be familiar with the ebb and flow of nature, the birdsong, the rustles of the undergrowth, the creaking of trees. Nature. Whether as a child picking up a stick, or an adult intrigued by a gnarled bit of bark, nature has piqued our interest since long before we evolved into the creatures we are today. Nature alone is enough to keep people interested for ages, only held back by our imagination. Although sometimes our imagination runs wild and gets the better of us, like that time in Cyprus, where Abby and I were exploring this ruin. One tunnel led into this dark cave, and this was before you could turn the flashlight on your phone. Nope. And we left the dark tunnel alone. All we know is, we are sure we heard bats. Or at least thought we did. We never went back, and to this day, what lies beyond only exists in our imagination. And yes, this is the actual picture of said cave, said ruin. And that's nature's gift. And nature would have been a prime source of entertainment for millennia. Sticks become swords, and curved twigs become bows, and soon even a peasant child is a knight of Arthurian legend, or some local hero. And by the late 13th century, even Robin Hood. Though without his merry men, as they would be added much later. So far I've covered pretty much what the imagination conjures up with nature. What else would captivate the medieval mind? So leading on from this would be the art of storytelling, letting our imagination run wild and passing it down to each generation. From the lowliest villain to the court of the king, everyone would have access to someone telling a story. Could be listening to tales of friends who ventured into the woods and saw a deer, or the elder in the village telling folk tales passed from generation to generation, a local priest in the local church with his fiery sermons that gripped his congregation, to long drawn out poems recited in the Baron's Hall telling of legendary heroes like Beowulf. Books were part of this, assuming you had the wealth, beautifully written and illuminated in French, German, Arabic, Welsh. Not everything was written down in Latin, though it was certainly the most universal. You may have heard of the Proas Edda, a Norse saga telling of Asgard, Odin and all the gods. Everything you would expect from the Viking Age. You'd be more surprised to learn it was actually written by Christians in the 13th century, long after the Viking Age. And also in the 13th century we had Marco Polo, the guy that invented the hole, his tales of his journeys across China, Meeting people with a culture so alien to ours would have been as awe-inspiring to the medieval mind as a NASA trip to Mars. As it filtered down and imaginations ran wild, you get tales of dogmen, wild men, all kinds of strange anomalies that people imagined that lay in wait at the edge of the world. Edge of the world? Yeah, nah. Not that the medieval mind believed the world was flat, they didn't. That's very much a myth. The current educated theory was the world was a globe, and scientific theory was contained in books, as well as religious theory, which was always intertwined. There were many books, and many great stories to be told, and without copyright laws, anything can be rehashed and retold. It was pretty much like the internet in years gone by. So from here, I move on to games, starting with basic ones that children learn at early ages, like pinch-in games, tag. Footman's Blind, a variation of Blind Man's Bluff. You basically pulled the hood over your eyes while your mates pinched and tugged you, probably ending up on a wrestle on the ground or a headlock or something. Depending on the crowd, it could be pretty rough. It's quite a thought, though, that the same games that we ourselves grew up with were played by our ancestors hundreds, if not thousands of years back. Basically, chasing after your mates and possibly annoying everyone else around you in the process. Not everyone grew up playing these games, and there were many other ways for children to entertain themselves. Girls would no doubt gravitate to daisy chains and other floral garlands. Given even the poorest could make something from offcuts or chaff, kids weren't without things to play with. And the more upscale you go, the more appears, like games of dice, namely Hazard, similar to craps, or Zara. Dice themselves had pretty much vanished during the so-called Dark Ages, reappearing in the 11th century. And dice weren't uniform like ours today. For a start, the numbers would be arranged different. They used the prime configuration, that is, 2 is opposite 1, 3 is opposite 4, etc. It's the Renaissance which changes this to the 7s configuration, as in opposite sides add to 7, hence 6 is opposite 1. But in our period, dice were the good old primes, and a little bit smaller than the big Roman puckers. Oh, and the oldest 20-sided dice? Ptolemaic Egypt, 2nd century BC. Although they probably weren't using them to slay orcs and goblins. About board games, there were a few, namely chess, but although it looks the same as the chess we are familiar with, it was played slightly different. For a start, the queen could only move one space, and the bishop could only move 2. Going bigger, there were games of lawn tennis, jeu de paume, where people would hit the ball with their hands, originating in the French monasteries of the 12th century, so even the monks weren't all about silence and prayer. Even the royalty liked to play it, and by the 13th century, jeu de paume had been moved from the lawn to an enclosed court. You've now got court tennis, although it's not called that yet. Ball games in general were pretty popular, and there were many. Unfortunately, there's no cricket. That didn't come around until Elizabethan times, though a precursor did exist. Hitting a ball with a stick is hardly rocket science, is it now? But that's not what you really want to hear about, is it? So let's get straight into football. Football has been going around since the classical period, but we're going to be concentrating on the medieval game, more famous for being banned in many circumstances in Europe. Mob football had many variations. All were a far cry from the 11-man matches we're familiar with today, and if anything, had more in common with rugby, though with none of the rules that later codified the sport. These were anarchic, rough games played between towns and villages involving a ball made of leather or a pig's bladder, in some cases even wood. You would move the ball to agreed markers, in any manner needed. Feet, hands, heads, just get the ball to the marker. Even by the 12th century, it was pretty tribal, so nothing's changed. The chronicler Matthew Paris mentions feet being used in the 13th century when he describes 24 boys kicking the ball with their right foot. The game would guarantee violent clashes, with players ending up on the ground, often hurt. On rare occasions, people even died, such as when one chap hurled a stone, killing an opponent, or another chap who didn't remove his knife from his belt and ended up killing an opponent. Rougher than an old firm derby. Over the centuries, they tried to ban it countless times, to no avail. Just proves if you can't beat them, join them. And by the Victorian age, the sport goes separate ways, with one school of thought suggesting that football is to be kicked, and the other school of thought carried under the arm. Or in some cases, just ignore it altogether.
Hooray!
Music is loved by all, both religious and secular. But do take in mind, there is no way to record it, so the only way to listen to it is to hear it live. Whether just simply singing to the wide range of instruments available. You got harps, flutes, lyres, hurdy-gurdy, bagpipes, fiddles. There is an influx of instruments from the Middle East. But it's going to sound different than what you'd imagine medieval music to sound like. These days, our music uses the tonality theory. Listen to any bardcore or Hollywood medieval music. Whereas medieval music went by modality. In fact, what we'd call Eastern music was pretty much the norm, given that the modal system hailed from ancient Greece. And vocals were increasingly often the focal point, allowing the minstrels, the singers, to conjure tales of chivalry, romance, and wild adventures. Some of the minstrels were paid huge amounts, and we're talking like £13 to £30 for a night of entertainment. That's not per head, I mean that's what they're getting paid, so some lords going to have paid that. But it means these musicians are pretty well off. It's not like they're playing concerts for the general public, they're getting paid to perform for a rich elite. But the peasantry wouldn't be without music, as anything could become an instrument, especially when backed up with vocals. Look at a 1950s skiffle band to see the kind of things that can be created from odds and sods. And at school, we used to mock "Stand by Me" by running a cone down the casing of a cassette tape. The hilarity. So even at the most lowest scale, people are bound to come up with something. And at the top end, you will even see music theory getting written down in manuscript, so we know the general flow of the music and where the notes went. Though, again, it's not like what we're used to. I suppose it's a bit like improvised jazz, where musicians see the same scale differently and add their own flourishes during a session. And many of these troubadours, i.e. lyrical poets often seen with lyre in hand, were actually high nobility, like William, Duke of Aquitaine, and Earl of Venderdorn. That's like the Duke of Norfolk or Lord Bath touring Europe with a band and publishing poetry. And dancing was huge also. Humans are humans. We hear music, we move in some way or other. Heads bobbing to "At Them On" as he twangs his strings. Or admiring the beautiful Lombarda, a 13th century troubadouress whose voice soothed the hardest of hearts, famous in her time for songs of courtly love and romance. So that's music in a nutshell. It's loved by everyone. And what about plays? They didn't start with Shakespeare. Plays have been going on for millennia, from the theatres of ancient Greece to the Odeons of Rome and beyond. But what kind of plays would be seen in the medieval era? Were they really still performing Greek tragedies in the Middle Ages? Well, unfortunately not. Even Italy was only doing the occasional Roman one. Times had moved on, and a new wave of theatre had hit Europe. You had miracle plays, theatre with a religious base, performed usually on saint days, born out of the church's need to explain the Gospels to the illiterate masses. A mystery play might involve stories like Adam and Eve and the snake. Masks were often used, which is part of mummy, as well as a whole host of props, depending on the production. You'd have altars and vestments, etc. Performed on two-storey wagons, they must have been quite the spectacle, much like an attraction at a modern fairground where it can be assembled and taken down in a single day. These could have travelled around, performing to quite an audience. Though you'd be surprised as to his conducting some of these plays. In York, the play known as The Death of Christ is performed by the Guild of Butchers, while The Coming of the Three Kings is done by the Guild of Goldsmiths. And you never guess who performs the building of the Ark. Yep, the shipwrights. And some of what was going on was absurd, and we today would probably imagine it to be heretical, and we'd probably be surprised to hear that the medieval mind loved satire, and loved seeing irony and farce in a religious play. Take in mind, we're not talking about making Jesus a joke, but Pilate, the rabbis, some of the humour bordered the life of Brian. They'd probably been hysterics. And you had nativity plays, which were introduced in 1223 by St. Francis of Assisi. You can imagine all kinds of silliness going on, from production to production. Assisi used live animals for a start to represent, well, the animals. Just imagine the chaos. It all in the name of fun. And education, of course. Classics like farces were all the rage, pointing out the absurdity of life and political satire. Medieval people of all classes loved toilet humour, Chaucer being the perfect example, 14th century, and manuscripts are littered with references to farting. In fact, the oldest recorded joke in history is a fart joke, written around 1900 BC in Samaria. And nothing has changed since. We're still obsessed with Biggus Dickus, as would our medieval counterparts. And you had street performers, jugglers, all kinds of people you see in any fair. So far, there's quite a lot to do all year round, with many festivals and holidays enjoyed by people of all classes, which often included lavish feasts. Because people in the Middle Ages loved to feast. Basically, a good excuse for a mass pig out involving lots of food and gallons of wine and ale. All the important people sat at the high table, and depending on the size of the feast, you had the second mess and reward. Servants bustling around, and a surprising amount of manners, like not buttering the bread with your thumb, and not spitting food across the table. This was not an uncouth day and age. It is brutal and barbaric, only when it needs to be. For the majority of the time, it's elegant, but we're not quite at the Renaissance yet. Feasts would have entertainment, like the minstrels we described earlier. They'd be jugglers, mimes, it'd be fun, and yes, there'd be a farter. Hooray! Imagine eating when the performer is promoting his art of sounding like a flatulent ogre. Although this chap is one of the highlights. One master of the world's first wind instrument was Roland the Farter. His act of one jump, one whistle and one fart was loved by Henry II, and he was given a manor in Suffolk. Farters were still going on right up until the Victorian day and age, with Le Pitelmain, who was as famous as Ricky Gervais is today. So, even in feasts, it seems the food was secondary, much like a modern cabaret, when you wine and dine to the entertainment. But while on feasts, I cannot leave out hunting. A pastime reserved for the aristocracy, who controlled the forests under strict laws and regulations, where nobles, aided by packs of dogs, would sally forth into the forests, hunting anything that moves, from wild deer to wild boar, or with the boar being driven to extinction, eventually along with the wolf. A dangerous pastime, where many were injured, even killed, like William II, Rufus, son of the Conqueror, killed while on a hunt in the New Forest, although here he was killed by one of his own men, put down to an accident. Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah. It was not a conspiracy, allegedly, but many conspiracy theories have erupted over the centuries. Right, and it wasn't just hunting with dogs and horses. Hawking, falconry, was popular pastime, and the nobility especially would love to head out with hunting birds on their arm. There are many depictions of this in the manuscripts, even on the Bayeux tapestry. And there were many birds, like eagles, peregrine falcons, gerfalcons, as the nobility liked to hunt with birds as well. Birds that are more happy to oblige. And some birds hunt other birds, like the sparrowhawk. Clergy preferred hunting with sparrowhawks over hunting with dogs, probably because dogs can't fly. Though, often, the spectacle of just watching the birds of prey interact is the spectacle in itself. And falconry is still going on today. And last of all, I'll leave you with the other pastime loved in the Middle Ages, the one you've all been waiting for, the joust. Probably the most famous part of the era. 2 armoured knights charging headlong, with the aim to unhorse their opponent. It's the Roman arena reversed. Here, the upper crust of society, including the king, will compete for entertainment. Imagine that! Around 80 to 100 pounds of armour, 40 kg, full chain mail from head to toe, topped by a helm, shield on the arm, and lance on the right, mounted on a special breed of horse called a destrier. Eventually, clad in plate armour, both rider and horse. Lances and swords would be blunted. It's expensive, it's lavish, the cream of the crop. Many of these knights were household names, like the sorts of stars of our era. Figures like the legendary William Marshall and Sir John Destrier. These knights were a stock character in many a play, the epitome of chivalry and virtue. Initially, the joust was more a melee, with hundreds of knights all scrapping over a large expanse. The beherd or the bowherd, a mock battle, more dangerous than any hunt. Knights would fight in formation as they would in a real battle. The knight's charge was brutal, seldom countered. The weight and momentum became a lethal and unstoppable force, capable of breaking any enemy line. When a Byzantine princess witnessed Frankish knights charging in a formation, she reckoned they could break the walls of Constantinople itself. They dominated warfare, and what a better way to show it than in front of the public? In 1241, around 80 knights were killed in one bowhurt tournament. This was little more than battle practice, salting the wheat from the chaff. But by the late 13th, things had changed considerably, and in the 14th century it's the classic one-on-one joust we're all familiar with. Gone was all the barbarity, and in was the more refined spectacle that you'd see in any reenactment today. And it continues right up until the Tudors, with a certain red-headed royal spare, Prince Harry, being famous in the jousting arena. This particular Harry became King Henry VIII, and unfortunately was injured so badly during a joust, it would affect his health for the rest of his life. So, the Middle Ages wasn't as boring as people may have thought. You'd have other things like embroidery, and many other ways to entertain yourself, and other fun things. But I think I've covered the essentials. So next time you're out in the woods, stop and listen. Let your imagination run wild, and pick up a stick. Thank you for watching.